Somebody tell them the action is on the air. The Reverend Dr. Al Sharpton is with the family of Corey Jones this morning. Corey Jones is a young man, a 31-year-old musician who was shot by an off-duty police officer right in Palm Beach County. His funeral is this morning at the Payne Chapel AME Church in West Palm Beach. Reverend Sharpton is standing with the family along with Attorney Ben Crump and others who are of National Action Network, all of whom are calling, of course, for a full and fair investigation of the situation there. Reverend Sharpton will be back with us next week here at the House of Justice, and of course our prayers go out to the family of Corey Jones and for the safe travel of all of those who are traveling to and from Florida this morning. Also, Reverend Ron Control look into the issue of just whether or not and to the extent of which gun violence plays into the public health of this nation. It is a scourge. It is a tremendous problem. You don't know what it's like to have families devastated, particularly by gun violence. It is devastating the youth of our nation. It tears families apart. And many of you probably have family members who have suffered. You have heard me talk about in my family the tragedy involving my sister who was murdered by a stalker. Not only was my sister murdered, but one of our other relatives who was in the house at the time was murdered in that same incident. My niece was shot in that incident. Thank God she survived. And of course, the perpetrator killed himself with the weapon that he used to kill the others. So this touches many families. And you know, when we wake up, when we see what happened in South Carolina, where someone can go into a church, sit and participate in the Bible study, and then take a gun purchased legally and kill the members of that church. It was horrific, and thank God that this nation stood up and demanded that things happen. And of course, in one of the centers of that controversy, given that it was South Carolina, of course, was the forcing of the state to take down the Confederate flag, since the perpetrator of that instance used the Confederacy as a motivation for his acts. We've seen the situations in Aurora, California, in Aurora, Colorado. We've seen the situations in other parts of the country on campuses across this country where there have been mass shootings, all of which, by the way, are usually with legally possessed weapons. And then, of course, you look at the urban communities where gun violence is, again, a very serious problem. Many have urged it to be a public health issue where, in essence, you have young men living in communities, for the most part, that are underserved, for the most part, where families do not have all of the resources that other families may have to really provide foundations to raise their children, and many of them get diverted into street gangs and other situations where they eventually encounter weapons, usually illegally possessed, and of course often engage in violence and murder, which not only takes the life of the person that was killed, but for the most part takes the life of the person who also did the killing, because you have two young people who lose their lives, one to death, the other to prison, which is as good as death in many cases. So we're going to talk about this morning. It should be a great panel. We have tremendous people with us this morning participating in this, many of them who should have some great insights and thoughts on this, and who have experience in this. First, of course, is our own dear sister, Aisha Sekou, who's the founder of Street Corner Resources and also the head of the Anti-Violence Committee here at National Action Network. We have Lear Gunn Barrett, who's the executive director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. We have Jermaine Reed. Do we have Jermaine Reed? No. Okay. We have Radell, who's a former gang member. He's a Crip from the Bronx, New York. We have FWE, who... Five, okay. Who is part of the Incarcerated Nation. We have Brother Chuck Berkeley, who's retired NYPD police officer. Welcome to all of you. Let me start with you. Well, actually, yeah, let me start with you, Aisha, because, you know, the work here at National Action Network, you get up every Saturday and you talk about the situations that you have had to deal with during the course of the week. You've talked about situations where you have to go into families in so many ways to try to help them deal with either someone in their home who is a perpetrator of violence or someone in their home who's been a victim of violence. What does that mean for you on a day-to-day basis, and how has that motivated you to do what you do?
Well, let me just start by saying thank you to Reverend Dr. Al Sharpton, and of course you, my brother, Attorney Michael Hardy, and all of those here at the National Action Network and in my listening voice for the support that we've received around dealing with this issue of gun and gang violence, and of course all of the panelists I've worked with, and including those anti-violence activists like Beloved, who was in the audience. So for me, personally, you know, I take this issue personal, because I know too many people who have lost life in front of the gun and behind the gun, just like you said, Attorney Michael Hardy, that our young people are filling the prison at such a fast rate that there is a guarantee on the fill rate of the prison, that so much so that they can guarantee that the prison will be full. Mothers are losing their children to the grave. The undertakers are making the money. And our communities are absent and void of young people who can provide later leadership in our community. So our community is suffering all the way around from gun violence while other people are profiting. And so my question was why couldn't people jump in and help at an earlier time? And that did not happen. So what we're seeing are the result of letting this problem go over a long period of time. We are also affected by this whole culture of the music and the video games and the no snitching. This no snitching thing is keeping the guns in our community. It's keeping the shooter at large. People are hiding the shooter because it is more popular to not tell and not save your community and watch the demise of your community than it is to do the right thing. And the right thing can be done anonymously. So we have a whole host of issues. We also have young people who have been medicated very early on drugs like Haldol and other drugs that create violent behavior. We have young people who have been distanced and disconnected from their families because they have been in foster care and other places where they may have suffered abuse. And so we have very angry children who try to self-medicate on things like Molly's and of course K2, which we've dealt with right here at the National Action Network. So this issue of gun violence is a systemic issue. It's not one problem. And then, of course, I'm sure that Leah is going to speak to the issue of guns coming into our community so easily. And when guns are so easily available, there's not the old-fashioned, you know, I'm mad at you, Attorney Hardy, and so we have the fight after school, and then we're at the party on Friday night together because everything is fine. These kids pick up guns, and the resolve is to shoot and take a life, like we just recently saw in Brooklyn, where the young man who was 17 was killed in broad daylight in front of his schoolmates. So I'm not going to belabor the point. I want the people on the other folks, wonderful folks on the panel. I'm glad to have Radell, who is a Crip. We've been beginning our relationship together, working to bring Bloods and Crips together for peace. And I think that that's at the head of it. Our young people's voices have to be at the head of driving the solution to this issue. So with that, that's my opening statement. And I'm hoping that the issues that I address, that others can further address those issues.
Well, Radell, why don't you talk to us about what brings you to the table? How does your experience make you now want to work with someone like Aisha, and just generally some of the things that you're doing?
Well, being a Crip, our main goal was to basically it's about reconstructing our community. We stand for community revolution and progress. So being the fact that we was a part of this organization, the point of the organization is to sit there and reconstruct and basically keep the safety to your communities. When the police brutality is going on and all the negativity is going on inside your communities, we also be able to sit there and outweigh those negativities and able to sit there at the same time, separate the negatives from the positives. Now the problem is with our communities, we have a lot of gun violence inside our communities. And the problem with that is, due to the fact that we have the youth going into these gangs, and you have the youth coming OGs and leaders of these gangs, the leaders are sitting there taking the guns and they're putting it in the youth hands. Now, us as a community, we know who lives in our community. We know who's doing what inside our community. But at the same time, we don't stand up to sit there and speak on who's doing what in our community. And that becomes a big problem. So now when you have leaders that's distributing drugs and distributing guns and telling this person to go kill that person over a color or over some type of turf name or some type of drugs, that becomes a problem. So now us as people, we need to step up and sit there and start to crack down on the leaders, crack down on the OGs and the thugs that's inside our communities and basically portraying to give out guns and give out drugs to our youth. And that's why I'm now working with Aisha Sekou as a Crip, because we basically about reconstructing our community.
All right, and we're going to come back and want to touch on some of the things that you just said in that statement. Before I go to 5, because I want you to talk about Incarcerated Nation, I just want everyone to recognize, of course, we have one of the giants of our movement. He visits with us often. He's here on a lot of Saturdays. He's the head of the House of the Lord Church in the great borough of Brooklyn. Everybody knows, Reverend Sharpton always says, just follow the road to freedom and it'll take you right to the House of the Lord Church at 415 Atlantic Avenue. It is the Honorary Bishop, Reverend Dr. Herb Daughtry. All right, we appreciate you being with us, Reverend Daughtry. 5, Incarcerated Nation, just tell us briefly what the organization is and then some of the work that you're doing.
Yes, my name is Five Mualim Aka. I'm the director of the Incarcerated Nation Corp. The Incarcerated Nation is a collective of previous incarcerated professionals working to support projects and create projects that do direct service to those incarcerated, their family members, and also those directly impacted by mass incarceration. We run 2 alternatives to incarceration and also a jail diversion program. And what we see a lot is mostly youth who are on probation for years. We have a lot of youth that we try to defer their time by saying, don't send this child to prison, sentence him to work in the community, sentence him to work in the church, sentence him to work on a community farm that we have where we grow peppers, and then we make Bronx hot sauce, and then we actually sell the hot sauce and provide the youth with a stipend. So alternatives to incarceration, because we've successfully brought mass incarceration to the front line, is what we need to start creating to divert youth from that. But what we see is a lot of youth who have joined gangs because of separation in their family, and the majority of those youth have a parent who's incarcerated. And then the disconnect from that creates a need for additional family members, a need for additional support, whether it's masculine or feminine support. And they find that sometimes, and people use that and manipulate that to create actions, right? We see that in third world countries where they recruit youth to kill the entire village. The same concept is used here in the States, but we need to, as a community, go back to the concept that it takes a village to raise a child, and that's what INC does, and provide projects, food pantry services, and also community resources that the youth can work in to serve their neighborhood, rather than serving time in prison where $88,000 can actually pay for college tuition, get them a Honda, and put a couple of $1,000 in their hand after buying all their books. So we spend more on incarceration than we actually do invest in our youth in the community.
All right, thank you. Leah, you are with the New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. Just tell us a little bit about the organization, what you do.
Sure, thank you for having me. Good morning. New Yorkers Against Gun Violence is a statewide organization, and since 1993 we've been working to reduce gun violence, find solutions to preventing it at the education level and also through advocacy. So here in New York City we have an education program, Aisha is aware of it, Reaction, when we go into high schools. And it's a year-long or a semester-long program where we basically teach young people living in communities that are affected by gun violence how to become advocates for themselves, first of all, and their friends, and then their communities. We take them to Albany, and they meet their legislators, they tell their stories, and they advocate for change. It all really comes down to the gun violence problem in our country, to the easy availability of guns, and Aisha spoke to this. You've seen over the past 20 or 30 years the National Rifle Association becoming incredibly powerful in terms of advocating for no gun regulations. The last significant federal law regulations we have were in 1993 with the Brady background checks, which are not comprehensive background checks, nothing since then. In fact, Congress has taken action to weaken the power of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to actually enforce the few gun laws that we have at the federal level. And most insidious, 1996, they actually cut off federal funding to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, which is doing some very promising research on gun violence in this country, showing that having a gun in your home does not protect you. Really solid evidence. And we desperately need funding. So this has not been studied for 20 years at the federal level, which is a disgrace, given that guns shoot. 120,000 Americans are shot every single year, and over 33,000 of them die. But of those who are injured, some of them, and I'm sure you can speak to this, Rydell, have life-threatening injuries. You know, young men in wheelchairs, you know, traumatic injuries, children who have been shot and have terrible scars. This really devastates communities. And so as a nation, we need to wake up and see this as a public health crisis. Reinstate federal funding for gun violence research. Without good evidence, you can't design good policy, which has been the intent of the NRA all along. And let's don't forget, the NRA is in it to sell guns, and they don't care to whom they sell those guns, right? They don't give a damn. All they care about is making money. And they're a very blood-soaked industry, and I think they need to be called to account. Our politicians are to blame, not all of them, of course. Many good ones here in New York, but many politicians are literally in the pocket of the National Rifle Association. There are 5 I'll call out here in New York State who receive money from the NRA. There's a really good website called nracongress.com. I urge you to go to that. You can go to the state of New York and see that Christopher Gibson received $16,000 from the National Rifle Association. Tom Reed, another upstate congressman. Lee Zeldin from Long Island. Christopher Collins. These are congressmen who are representing us in New York who are voting against the interest of New Yorkers. It's important for us to know that and to hold them to account, because when they vote against background checks, expanding background checks, when they vote against making gun trafficking a felony, right now gun trafficking gets the same penalty as trafficking a chicken. That is wrong. Guns kill people, chickens don't unless they have salmonella, right? Okay, so you need to call our leaders, so-called leaders, to account when they're actually taking money from an industry organization, which is what the NRA is, and that money is used to have them vote against the interests of New Yorkers. We are dying. We have the 3rd lowest gun death rate in the country, but we still had 863 gun deaths in 2013. We don't have the federal figures yet for 2014 and 15, but people are continuing to die. We know that. And it's not just in the streets through gang violence, it's domestic violence, it's suicide. There were more gun suicides in New York State, 52%, than homicides. And it's accidental shootings. I don't say accidents, it's unintentional, because when guns and kids are involved, it's no accident. Adults should be responsible and keep those guns locked up.
Again, Leah, we want to come back because there's a lot there. We want to break down some of that. But just before we do, let me go to Detective Berkeley. You are retired from the New York City Police Department. While you were on the force, I'm sure some part of your experience, of course, was probably dealing with some of the youth situations, gang violence. From your perspective, while you were both on the department, with the department and now, what's your perspective on some of this?
Well, everybody usually knows me speaking against police brutality and police homicide in our community. But I also come from Harlem, right? And you're right, I did have experience coming into the community because of the gun violence. I mean, I care about my community, born and raised in Harlem. And because I'm off the police department doesn't mean that my job is ended there. I help my sister Aisha, and I go around the city and help any and everybody who calls for my help. Guns, you know, you know, I don't bite my tongue for anything. All right, and I give it to you like the way it is. I am not anti-police, but one of the problems is when you pick up the paper and you find out that there's police officers that are bringing illegal guns into the city. All right, we need to address that also. But however, I'm here to help my community. Guns destroy communities, and let me tell you something, and I make no bones about it. If the police want to keep guns out of the community, the police can do it. They know where all the guns are. They don't know where all the players are, but if they really wanted to end this, they can end this. Because when you really look at it, certain areas in the city, drugs don't even come into. So how could you stop drugs from not coming into one part of the community, but when it comes to our communities, we have not just drugs, we have guns, and we have all types of other things that come into our community. So if the police really want to stop it and nip it in the bud, they can. They don't because it's numerous reasons why they don't. And it's money out here, all right? And they really don't care. At times I feel they really don't care. That stop and frisk, when you looked at it, only less than 1%. 1% of weapons were taken. So stop and frisk wasn't the answer. Stop and frisk is still not the answer. And stop and frisk is still going on. All good police officers and detectives know that if you really want to stop a person and find out if they're carrying a gun or anything, all you got to do is really just make eye contact. 9 times out of 10, you make eye contact, that person is out of here. You don't have to stop, violate them, degrade them, pulling their pants down and everything in front of everybody, and then sending them on their way when they don't have anything, because that's part of the problem.
And I want to stay right there. Before I come back, before I follow up with you, of course, as always, every Saturday we have with us the family of Eric Gardner. National Action Network has stood with that family from the very beginning. Again, Eric, not a victim of gun violence, but a victim of violence, and was killed as a result of being choked to death. And of course, Esau Garner Snipes, his wife is with us, and his mother, Gwen Carr, is with us in the audience, and as she is on many Saturdays, and we should give her a big hand because both her and Emerald, who actually works here at the National Action Network, not only did they come into this movement as victims, but they have done everything they can to become leaders in the fight for justice and for better communities across the country. And we appreciate all that you do for that, Sister Carr, and of course, Esau. We thank you all for that. Let me come back to you, Detective, because you touched on the whole issue of stop and frisk. In many ways, the police used it really as an excuse because they could claim that they were dealing with the gun problem through stop and frisk, and as you so correctly pointed out, that stop and frisk produced very few contrabands in those stops. In fact, 90% of the people that were stopped unconstitutionally, which is why the court declared the manner in which New York City engaged in stop and frisk to be unconstitutional. But the police do have a role here and can have a role in terms of addressing this issue, particularly the issue of the illegal guns that are in our community. You said that the department could do more. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, what I mean is, when you really look at coming up, I'm 53 years old, coming up in Harlem, you know, one of the ways that our parents used to make a little bit of money is, you know, playing illegal numbers. The police knew where all of the numbers were. When I came on the police department, I was under the impression that the police did not know where all the number spots were. When I came on, I found out that they did know. And what I'm saying is they have resources where they can find where these guns are coming in. They can stop them at the border. They can stop them at the state of New York. They don't want to do it. You know, and the reason why they don't want to do it is because we all know that crime pays. You know, and it's sad. So I know that they can do a lot. And what the police need to do is stop being our enemies and really be our friends in the community. Because when you come in our communities and propose to be an enemy, right, no one wants to help you. You know, no one. So then if you come with that attitude of that, I'm going to come in your neighborhood and I'm going to dictate to you how you should live and how to govern where you are, when you're not even there, you're only there for 8 hours. You know, and then you go back to East Cupcake, there's a problem. You know, they can, the police department can reach out to people like myself. Eric Adams is a Brooklyn Borough president, right? We are all ex-cops, the National Latino Officers. They can reach out to us and ask us to help our communities, but they won't do it because when I came on the police department, I joined 2 other organizations, the 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care, the National Latinos, and what we did was we fought against the injustice that the NYPD was inflicting on our neighborhoods and our communities. And because we did that, we were ostracized, so they don't want our help, but we can do a lot help in our communities.
But just to stay there for a second, how do we do that? I mean, what is it about? Is it the leadership? Is it the people that we are electing to lead the city? I mean, what is the answer? It would seem as though, and again, there's always a balance. I mean, look, Officer Holder was killed this week. That was tragic. It was wrong. It was done by someone who should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law and suffer whatever penalties come as a result of having done that. But the gun that he had was an illegally possessed weapon stolen and trafficked to New York. And we understand the dynamics, the racial dynamics, the whole problem of diversifying the police department. It would seem as though, if you're really into protecting and serving in public service, that there is a real solution to addressing communities respectfully, as you say, but addressing the issue and helping these communities to be safe.
Well, I agree, but you know, there's not no one answer, but like you said earlier, everyone shares in this. Some of our elected officials, like you heard the young lady here say, some of them got to share this blame too. Some pastors have to share the blame. It's enough blame to go around for everyone. We have to all come together, you know, to fight this problem. The police cannot do it by themselves, and my heart goes out to Officer Holder also. I did the job, I came on in '84, I left in 2004. But again, and I don't want to get off the subject, but again, Brother Hardy, you know, when the police break into people's houses, such as Ramali Graham, when they did to Eric Garner, what they did, and when I spoke out against the Eric Garner incident in Staten Island, the next night I had a rap put on my car. And this is coming from NYPD. But you know what? It doesn't stop me, and they're never going to stop me, and I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. But getting back to this problem, one of the ways we're fighting is like we have other people, like such as the gang members, we're reaching out to them. They know how these guns are coming in. The gentleman here just said, who is partly responsible. But do you think the community really wants to give up them and go to the police? No. We need to do this as a collaborative effort, and we need to bring everybody in, you know, and I'm willing to go to some of these OGs or whatever and speak to them and say, hey, brothers, you know, or sisters, listen, give me the guns and I'll turn them in. You know what I'm saying? But we need a collaborative effort to fight.
Well, let me ask you, because you touched on, in terms of your program, you know, alternative to incarceration, getting some of the young people that would go into prison, which many correctly point out really just reinforces conduct as opposed to offer corrective to conduct. And we all know, I mean, many of us who grew up in the 60s, I guess, had alternatives. There really were alternatives to having to be forced into a gang. Because, you know, even I can remember growing up, there was never a day after I turned 13 years old where I did not have a job in the summer. So I didn't have to rob somebody to be able to go buy my vines, as we used to say back then. You know, you worked. I mean, you worked, you got up in the morning, you know, it gave you a sense of responsibility. Some of the things that you talk about seem to address that? And does that, how much of a role does that play, not only in trying to reshape young people, but how much does it play into the whole effort, again, to control the distribution of guns in this nation? We have, and Leah, you can probably know the number, there are probably a gun for every individual in this nation, which is over 300 million. So that's a lot of guns.
No, actually, the sad part, when you speak about employment, that's a very powerful fact, but even in West Harlem, in the district that I work, we have thousands, not hundreds, thousands of kids who miss out on the Summer Youth Lottery. And what is just sad is that they give this t-shirt when you go to sign up for Summer Youth, so you have thousands of kids walking around with a Summer Youth t-shirt on with no job during the course of the year. And we don't make the investment in our community. You know, it's sad when I have to hear Tales of Chucky when he talks about how certain communities, because I don't believe in crime. I believe certain community people commit acts and certain acts are criminalized and certain communities get criminalized. And it's sad that his same criteria when he was sent to the Central Park District to work and ticketing people in the park for drinking alcohol and was like, well, why are you doing this? And he was like, well, I did this in the other community. Why can't I do this as part of my job in this community? And he was reprimanded for that. So when we have officers who can particularly infiltrate the community because they're community members and give information, why not work with them, right? The other thing is gangs started as a community model. Literally, it was an organization that came from the Black and Civil Rights Movement, when you had the Black Panthers who would try to infiltrate street gangs and try to bring some type of continuance in them. They were wrapped up into COINTELPRO and considered terrorists. Even in the 60s and the 70s, inside of COINTELPRO, you have the Brims and the Stones, which organization stands for Striving to Overcome Negative Energy and Black Revolutionary Intelligent Militant Soldiers. These type of organizations were used to tutelage youth. But we don't have that type of community involvement no more, and the city and the government constantly criminalizes youth. In forest projects in the Bronx, we had a huge gang problem, and it ended up in the death of a young woman's son and in a shooting. And out of that came a community of youth that said, we're going to call ourselves Forest Over Everything to create a connective project inside that. And then they were all picked up by the feds as a gang. So we are actually criminalizing our youth. We spend $8 billion a year incarcerating our youth. $8 billion. We just finished a film that Disney helped us promote in Fusion TV called Prison Kids, which we aired here actually a few weeks ago. And this is the sad circumstances that we criminalize our youth instead of being a community to do that. And I think that the number one fact that I think that Chucky can attest to is gun buyback. Those have been the most successful programs where we offer, instead of going to rob someone with this gun, let me just buy that weapon from you. And then a lot of those reports detail that those guns all came from out of the state, all came illegally smuggled into the state for violence. So we allow that to happen in our community when we don't take up our youth, when we look at them as an enemy, when we have the older population in our community saying, oh, the youth is the problem. No, the problem is that we don't treat it like a village and we don't all pay responsibility in that child's molding. So alternatives to incarceration is the answer to rather saying, no, I'm not going to let this kid get. I have kids that are in small schools. I mean, literally 9th, 10th, 11th grade with 5-10 years probation. And any type of police conduct adds up to another felony, which adds to incarceration, right? So these efforts have to be made by us to say, listen, my organization can use some youth to do that. And then we actually embed that into our program to say that there's so much variety of things that youth can do rather than prison. Because I would rather pay for you to go to school and pay for you to sit in a cell idly and be victim of violence like Khalif Ryder. Won't you incorrect? Because 50% of youth suffer from mental illness and 70% are incarcerated, end up in solitary confinement because you're putting kids into adult circumstances and you're putting kids into Rikers where it's in a whole brutality violence, where that same kid across the street 10 feet away, it would be endangering the welfare of a minor if you touch that child can only work 4 hours a day, he can only get a bus pass, he can't even work a regular full shift job, and he has a curfew. Across the other side of the street, he's an adult. He has to understand his own legal representation and speak to his lawyer on behalf and know all of his healthcare needs and defend himself in prison against adult officers. So we have to take charge of that, and that starts with the community and community policing, because that doesn't happen no more.
And for some of the young folks that have gone through your programs, how do they fare?
They all have a reduction in their sentence. We work with the Department of Probation, which was a program that Clinton Lacey actually started. He wanted to create the neon hubs to put the probation officers inside the community so that the community can address the issues of youth right there, not some far-off, distant place. So we also asked for a reduction in their sentence, but even in our Harlem Youth Internship Project, the youth then work to create projects. They work with senators and assemblymen to learn more about incarceration. They actually educate their community, and they learn how they are the victims of the crime. Literally, they are the victims, because I see violence as when we starve youth to death, when we have children who go to bed hungry, when we do not care for them, when we have a system of the school to prison pipeline which normalizes the system of incarceration in our schools.
Right.
When we are penalizing the schools for everyday thing that kids do. I happen to own a teenager, not too responsible.
Yeah. Or have officers going into classrooms and tossing children. You know, that has to be restructured, and of course, hopefully that incident will lead to something positive. But I think, and you mentioned the film that was shown here last week, and it's a good opportunity to mention, because I think part of that whole string of things, of course, is second chance and reentry programs, again, which I think are important to the overall issue, and certainly helps to redirect people who may come out and go right back into their lifestyle. And of course, Victor Chance,
Victor Payton,
the
Second Chance Committee,
who runs the Second Chance program here at National Action Network, does tremendous work on that. Riddell, for you, what would you say are one of the things that helped you to turn, again, to say, you know, I've got to go a different road than the road that I'm on?
Well, it all started with the meaning of what the organization actually meant, Community Revolution in Progress. And the problem with the youth today is the fact that the youth is looking for acceptance. The youth is looking to basically be a part of something. The youth is looking to say, you know, I'm a part of this and I want you to notice me. And it starts with you being in school and you do something that's right, or you get a high grade and you go back home and you show your mom ignores it. It starts with that right there. The smallest things plays a big catastrophe. So now you come into the streets and you meet people that sits there and symbolizes a kind of unity, a kind of love to you. So now you become attached. And then when you become attached, you start getting the wrong teachings. If that person has the wrong teachers themselves, that becomes the problem. So now, like I said, as a community, we know what goes on and we know where everybody is at. It shouldn't be fair that I could go outside of my community and go into another gated community and see that it's a booth that's there, it's a security guard that's there, and he's taking names of who come in and who comes out, what apartment they goes in and who they going to see and what time they came in. Why should I have to go into my community and the only thing I got to do is sit there and wait for somebody to open the door? Or see a bunch of people that I know, or a bunch of people with strangers and gang members inside of my lobby bed, they're opening the door and they're just chilling in my lobby, even with the camera there. So it's like, it doesn't mean nothing. And that's the biggest problem right there. I would go into a different community and I would see all these different things going on, but I would come back to my community and it's like, we're being overseen. We don't matter. And that's the problem with the youth today. The youth wants to have a voice. The youth wants to be able to sit there and show the world that we do stand for something. But if you give us opportunity, we can sit there and show you that we stand for something. Going back to jobs. The reason why we sit there, we stay in the streets and people are selling drugs and stuff because of the lack of jobs. If the kids don't have nothing to do as far as after school programs or recreation activities or even a job, then they're forced to come into the streets. So now we have more jobs available where we don't have to worry about our criminal background hindering us from having opportunity. Or we don't have to worry about us being black taking us away from opportunity. Or we don't have to worry about, because we're from this neighborhood, that's going to take us away from opportunity. Those are the problems right there.
Right. Let me ask real quick. Do you run into issues where, you know, those that are, you know, that you used to run with step to you and say, you know, why are you doing what you're doing, and do you have to deal with that? How do you address that?
They have asked, but I don't run into issues. Number one, I have a street credibility, and I did become the top leader of this game, so I don't get questioned about it. And when they do, I tell them, the reason why I had joined this game because what it stands for, this game was birthed out of the Black Panthers with Huey P. Newton and the rest of the brothers that was part of that movement. Now, that basically played a part of police brutality, and we basically offended for ourselves in our community. So you guys are sitting there taking colors, and y'all making it a whole issue to where we have to sit there now and kill off our own over a color. So when they ask me, why do you decide to take the route that you want to take, I say, I'm not only doing this for me, I'm doing this for you, I'm doing this for my kids, and I'm doing this for the people that I see every day, and the people that I see outside of these communities that I walk past every day.
All right. Well, you know, I have said this to Aisha, that I think the person that can really get in here and begin to redirect some of this thing, particularly with the illegal distribution of weapons, will be worthy of a Nobel Peace Prize. But you touched on it in terms of the public health issue, but also in terms of the fact that there are no strong federal laws with regard to trafficking, with regard to store purchases. Can you just break that down again so that the audience really understands the significance of that and what we're talking about there?
Right. It all comes down to guns, as we said at the outset, are just too easy to get, and they should be hard to get. So at the federal level, you have the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, the NICS system as it's called. That was part of the Brady Bill. So if you go to a federally licensed firearms dealer, they're called FFLs, and you want to buy a gun, you have to undergo one of these background checks. And you're denied to purchase a gun if you pop up on the system as being a felon, had been adjudicated mentally ill, or if you had a domestic violence conviction. Other than that, if you have a violent misdemeanor or anger issues and local police know you're a person who probably shouldn't be trusted with a gun, you can still pass a background check. So, our federal standards for clearing people to buy a gun are too low, let's face it. Now, New York State has stronger standards. It's harder to get a gun here in New York State, which is why guns are trafficked in, right? You have to get a pistol permit. You have to apply for it through local law enforcement. They know the people in the community usually. Sometimes you need character references. You need, comprehensive background checks. You need maybe a mental health screening. So it's hard to get a gun in New York State, and it should be hard. And so at the federal level, about 60% we think of all gun sales are through federally licensed dealers. That leaves 40% that are not, which means those are gun shows, private sales, internet sales, armslist.com, and also straw purchases, which are done through FFLs, people walking in without a criminal record who will buy a gun for somebody else. The Badger case in Wisconsin.
Yeah, I was going to touch on that. I think that's important because, in that situation, well, you can explain it. It's a situation where the owner of the gun shop was being prosecuted because he knowingly allowed a store purchase.
That's right. It was caught on videotape, which made it very clear and explicit and very hard for a jury to say, no, this guy wasn't guilty. The person for whom the gun was being bought was in the store telling the person who's 21, the purchaser, what to do, how to fill out the form, and the gun store manager was helping as well. So it was very, very clear that this was, and if you're knowingly selling to a straw purchaser, that's against the law. But again, one of the other problems is the ATF, they get around and inspect these dealers, FFLs, maybe once every 10 years, probably more like once every 20 years.
Right. Now, are those situations that can be, the Wisconsin case is being prosecuted by the state, can that also be prosecuted federally?
It should be.
But you can't.
I'm glad you brought that up. Loretta Lynch, as our Attorney General, can do a heck of a lot more than she's doing by shutting down some of these dealers who are, we call them bad apple dealers. And we know that about 5% of the FFLs in the nation supply 90% of the crime guns. So you go in and shut them down, you go some way towards choking off the flood of guns that come into our communities here in New York.
And you often hear the whole situation where the whole the gun show loophole. Just explain to people what that means.
Well, yes, it's often called the private sale loophole. What that means is you only have to undergo a background check if you buy from a licensed gun dealer, but you can get guns very easily from your friend. That's a private sale. The internet, No, there's no regulation there at all. You can get them at gun shows in many states. New York has closed the so-called gun show loophole. You have to have a background check. But many states, Virginia is the #1 state supplying crime guns to New York. Georgia is the state that supplied the gun that killed the 2 police officers in December, almost a year ago, in Brooklyn. It came from Arrowhead Pawn Shop, which is a notorious place for people to get their crime guns. We know where these places are, and they should be shut down, put out of business, and made a spectacle of. And you know, we need to ask our leaders here in New York City and the state, the governor and the mayor, de Blasio, they need to let us know, let us have that data from the ATF. They trace crime guns, and they trace them back to the source of the store or where that gun came from by the serial number, and they have that data. Share it with the community. Let us know where the guns are coming from, because then we can actually protest. We can organize people to go down and stand in front of these stores and say, you're selling death.
Because these are the ones that are violating the
Yes.
laws, and
The
it would
data
be
is out there.
a
We need to
legitimate
demand it.
purpose to do so.
Absolutely.
Just let me touch on one other thing. In terms of the NRA, and of course the NRA is famous for saying that guns don't kill, people do. But at the same time, as you're saying, it would seem as though the NRA should have as much of an interest. I mean, because the issue is not the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment has been resolved. It's part of the Constitution. It's as much a part of the Constitution as the Fourth Amendment or the Fifth Amendment or the Sixth Amendment. So it's not the Second Amendment, and everyone knows that. However, it would seem that even their cause, in terms of people respecting the Second Amendment, would be enhanced if they would, and they have lots of resources, did more to support the works, let's say, of Incarcerated Nation and other groups that are working to prevent the illegal use of guns, or to highlight, you know, the mental health issues and things like that. Shouldn't they be more positively involved in this fight? And I'm sure you've had contact with them, and is that just an
No, I try to
impossibility?
avoid it. No, actually, you know, that's interesting you should say that. Any sort of credible national organization should do the right thing. But as I said earlier, the National Rifle Association represents gun manufacturers. Gun ownership is declining in the United States. Only 32% of households own guns. It's down from over 50% in the 1970s. So they are desperate to sell more guns to fewer people, which is what's happening. So the average gun owner owns 8, 10, 20 guns. Like the Oregon shooter, he and his mom in their apartment had 15 guns. I mean, who needs 15 guns? So the NRA doesn't give a damn who buys their guns. In fact, they're happy that these straw purchases are taking place, that these private sales are happening, and people are selling guns and trafficking them, because it's business. It's business for them.
Do you think there
And
are
by the way, NRA stands for no rational argument, or no, not real Americans.
Right. Do you think there are any legs to the divestment movement that many
Yes.
are talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a good important point to point out. We're trying to get the University of California system to divest from public gun stocks. That would be huge. It would be like in the 1970s with South Africa, the divestiture movement to divest of companies who do business in South Africa because of apartheid.
Right.
So yes, I think, and look at your own 401ks, look at your own investments, and see if they're invested in Sturm and Ruger, Smith and Wesson, and Olin. Those are the 3 American public gun companies.
So that's certainly an activity that could really have an impact on this issue.
Yeah, hit it where it hurts.
All right. And of course, we have a teacher who can teach to that, because Reverend Daughtry was so involved in the movement against apartheid in South Africa, and it's based on a similar principle in terms of divesting from the corporations that are invested in keeping these gun sales at the levels that they're at. Aisha, your work, again, and we've had a lot of discussion of how do we get really into the communities in ways that can be done safely, so that people can do that, and how do you encourage families to come forward, and how do you protect them in those situations?
Okay, first I want to just go back to something that was said about the arrest of our young people. What we have to look at is in grant houses right here in New York and probably across the country, the same thing has happened. Grant houses, Manhattanville, those young people those projects have been plagued with gun violence like most housing developments. 1,500 people living in one building with no recreation centers, no activities, gated lawns where people used to be able to go out and run and the kids would play, and the parks are in disrepair. Now people are almost those projects are becoming open air prisons. What we saw here in New York with the excuse of gun violence, 106 or maybe more young people taken down alone in Grant and Manhattanville. And at the time that those kids were 10, organizations like mine, Street Corner Resources, Perfect Peace Ministries, and some others, we were pushing and asking to unlock the housing community centers, and we were told no, and they had big padlocks on them. Those kids turned 18 just last year. We saw, and we talked about it right here at the National Action Network, we saw 106 plus young people, 15 to 24, incarcerated on a whole variety of charges under the Gang Abatement Act. Not just in those houses, but other public houses around the city. So we can't wait until kids go from 10 to 18, the age of incarceration and arrest, to begin to do something. So I just want to make sure that we say that. We can't sit and watch and wait for the destruction of our community. We have to take action. This is a no-wait, no-win situation. If we wait, we don't win. If we act, we can win. So the other thing I want to say is that young people...
And when we act, what is it that we
specific
should do?
things that we can do. We can become involved. Become the leader where you are. You don't have to wait for Aisha. You don't have to wait for Ashley Sharpton. You don't have to wait for Reverend Al Sharpton. We can become the leader right where we are in your housing development. Take it on. Find out what's not there. What do you think young people need? And ask them what they need. What would they like to see happen if they could have activities there? I do it all the time, and we just start doing it. Right now we have a writing workshop going on 140th Street while I sit right here. We have an art workshop that will happen right after that while I sit right here. Let other people do what they want to do in the community. As long as they don't charge, they bring their skills to the table and begin to have conversation while you are creating music and writing and dance and all of these things to get young people to make better decisions. The other thing is we have to use the people in our community. We have very highly skilled people. We have professional people like Brother Berkeley. We have people who are engaged in a lot of things. We have the youth huddle here at the National Action Network. We have to use whatever resources. We can't sit around and say that we don't have resources. We do. In Queens, we have 100 suits. Brother Kevin is in the audience. We have Beloved, who's working with young people. Every community has these people. This is not unique to New York, so we have to use the people that are in our community. We cannot let funding be the division as to whether or not we work with each other, because we do similar kinds of work, and that's what has happened in this city right here. That's what's happening across the country, because the money to fight gun violence is minimal. It's now becoming a cash cow. People are getting into this gun violence thing, not because they care about our kids killing each other, because this is a way to keep their organizations who have not done anything afloat. So we have to demand that those who are doing the work get the funding. And on that note, I just want to quickly just thank Reverend Al Sharpton. Street Corner Resources has just garnered a Curb Violence contract, and we're happy for the support that we've gotten from all over the city. NYPD, National Action Network, community boards have supported us, and that's what has to happen. Lastly, people like Rodell. This is not by accident that I've developed this relationship with this young man. Beloved is in our audience. When he came home from prison, same thing, same relationship. He is active in the community, fighting violence, taking on young people like Rodell. When Rodell said this is what he wants to do, I said we're going to create a greater platform for your voice so we can get more young people engaged. We have to not be afraid of whatever the look is. Pants sagging, hat backwards, hair locked, skin dark. We can't be afraid of those things. We have to embrace, because what sits inside of our young people is the power that you hear in a Rodell. So we can't have this locked up and locked down and nothing happens in our community. Change is with our young people. I really want to say thank you to all of the people on the panel, because I really feel like together, if we order our steps, and Ashley and I have talked about this, numerous times. We just want to really turn this wheel and make change, but it means that we can't just have the conversation. We can't just leave it to a few people. We need 5. We need Sister Leah. We need Brother Berkeley. We need all of these folks in our communities across the country to lock arms and say, we're going to stay on this until this gun violence stops. I should not have to, you should not have to sit with another parent who is trying to figure out how to bury a child. How did this happen? This is the saddest thing in the world. So together, I'm expecting that we're going to hear at the National Action Network chapters across the country, that we move forward on this issue. I can't do this by myself. This thing gets overwhelming for real. And so we have to really work together. So I'm looking forward to this also being a place to catapult to make change across the country.
So is there a national, in other words, that's great. And as you say, all of these organizations together could really have an impact. I mean, is there something that's coming together to help all of these groups begin to use their resources in a collective effort so that their influence could be spread even wider across the nation? And of course, with the governmental officials and entities that you have to influence to try to get something done.
Absolutely. One will be working right here in New York. Ashley Sharpton, myself, Dominique, Brother Kirsten Foy, Rev Kev will be putting together a strategic plan. This really requires, it's not just a committee. It requires everyone. So we're going to put together a plan for engagement and movement and activities for young people, and looking at what we need to advocate for to happen in communities across the country to help begin to change this. So people should look forward to something coming forth from us. We meet today for a few minutes to begin to put that plan in order, and then we'll stay on it and we'll continue to move it. We need people. We need people to help us. And Leah, we hope that you also work with us to make this happen, that everyone on the panel does.
No, I'm happy to. And I wanted to speak to a wider, even a bigger organization at the national level. The national groups are coming together, state groups, community groups, and it's called the Gun Violence Table. And I'd like to invite Aisha to come on to that. Anyone here who's interested, they're weekly phone calls.
All right.
You catch up on what's happening at the legislative level, at the community level, and we've created a new, because our movement, let's face it, has been perceived as too white, okay? And we're trying to change. It's true. It's true.
I think that's...
And we're trying to change that, because gun violence disproportionately affects communities of color. I know that to be the case. So.
I think that's great, and of course we're getting ready to wrap up. Let me add one more piece to this, of course, is as Dawn Jones said earlier, there are elections this next week. Coming up on November 3rd is Election Day in many places across the nation. Voting matters because, as many of you have pointed out, there has to be alternatives, and sadly, those alternatives unfortunately have to come through government investing in communities in the way that they need to be invested, so that the community centers are open, so that jobs are created, so that there are programs funded like Alternatives to Incarceration and the like. We want to thank all of you for participating. Give them a big hand. This is National Action Network. It is Saturday. It is the Action broadcast. Reverend Sharpton is in Florida this morning. He's been with the family of Corey Jones. It's a 31-year-old young man who was shot by an off-duty police officer. They are doing the funeral services at Payne Chapel AME Church in West Palm Beach, Florida. Our prayers go out to them. We thank them for that. Of course, that fight goes on. Reverend Sharpton will be back next week. We love you. We appreciate you. God bless you all. This is the Action Network. We'll see you next week. All right. We're not done, everybody. Let me get a little amen. Everybody sing. Everybody sing. Everybody sing. Everybody sing.
by the way,